and let it sort of set the context for our discussion. The mighty one, God, Yahweh. That's Lord in all capital letters is Yahweh, His name. The mighty one, God, Yahweh, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. Our God comes. He does not keep silence. Before Him is a devouring fire. Around Him a mighty tempest. He calls to the heavens above and to the earth that He may judge His people. Gather to me my faithful ones, who made a covenant with me by sacrifice. The heavens declare His righteousness, for God Himself is judge. Hear, O my people, and I will speak. O Israel, I will testify against you. I am God, your God. Not for your sacrifices do I rebuke you, for your burnt offerings are continually before me. I will not accept a bull from your house or goats from your folds, for every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? Offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and perform your vows to the Most High, and call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. But to the wicked, God says, what right have you to recite my statutes or take my covenant on your lips? For you hate discipline, and you cast my words behind you. If you see a thief, you're pleased with him, and you keep company with adulterers. You give your mouth free rein for evil, and your tongue frames deceit. You sit and speak against your brother. You slander your own mother's son. These things you have done, and I've been silent. You thought that I was one like yourself. But now I rebuke you and lay the charge before you. Mark this then, you who forget God, lest I tear you apart and there be none to deliver. The one who offers thanksgiving as his sacrifice glorifies me. To the one who orders his way rightly, I will show the salvation of God. We'll see in a minute a couple of reasons why I wanted to start here with Psalm 50. Throughout this study, what we are trying to do is to examine these so-called lenses of critical theory, these ways in which those who are influenced by critical theory, those who hold to critical theory, the ways in which they see the world. And so we've talked about 4 lenses of critical theory. Now, if critical theory throws you off, you might have heard the phrase critical race theory, sometimes abbreviated CRT, but that's just a subset of this broad idea of critical theory, okay? And this idea of critical theory is having a large influence upon our culture's understanding of what justice is and what constitutes injustice. So we're trying to examine these lenses through which critical theory views the world and then place those up against the backdrop of the story of Scripture. And so just, I think, to be a little more helpful in terms of memory, I've got these in groups of 4, right? We've got 4 lenses of critical theory and then the 4 parts to the biblical story. All right, what do you guys remember what those are? What are the 4 lenses? I asked this last week, but I'll ask it every week, okay? It's a good way to review. What are those 4 lenses through which those who are influenced or hold to critical theory view the world? The postmodern lens, which basically says there is no big overarching story and each individual or each community gets to determine truth for itself. That's the postmodern lens, looking at the world through that. What else? I'm sorry, what? Yeah, individual autonomy. Yeah, individual autonomy, which is also pushing this idea that the individual has self-rule, gets to determine truth for themselves. Okay? That's 2 of them. What were the other 2? Yes, the oppressed versus the oppressors. that the root cause of injustice is seen to be found in oppression. That is, two groups. You have the oppressed and the oppressors. Now, those might be defined in very different ways by people who are viewing the world in this way, depending upon other aspects of their background, right? So if you're reading something written by, say, a radical feminist, then it's the men oppressing women, is largely. Okay? But if you're reading from critical race theory, it's going to be the majority groups, usually in the West, it's usually whites or Europeans oppressing those of color, right? All problems are boiled down to those things. And we're not going to deny that those are realities, that men have done terrible things to women throughout human history, that racism is a real issue and a real thing. We're not going to deny that, but we're also not going to say that that's the root. We want to say that beneath that there's something else, right? Okay, so that's three of them. What's the fourth? Yeah, deconstruction. Deconstruction is the idea that things don't need to be fixed and repaired so much as they need to be torn down and something else built in their place. That's deconstruction, all right? Now, where did critical theory arise? It did not arise, for instance, in studies of race relations. It did not arise within gender studies or anything like that. It arose somewhere else, in some other academic discipline. Anybody remember where it came from? Yeah, it's about language, right? Yeah, it's about language. Arguments about how language works and what the function of language actually is. And that actually ends up being a subset of hermeneutics, which is the study of how you interpret and apply written texts, right? And so that's where it originated. That's where it came from. All right, but it's of course spread out into all those other fields of study. It's spread out and it's got tentacles everywhere. But it's helpful for us to understand the origins of it because that's going to color, that's going to impact the ways in which critical theory is applied in all these other areas. So we need to understand that and know that. Okay, so those are the four lenses. What are the four movements in the biblical story? Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. That's the story of the Bible in a nutshell. Or you could also say that's the story of human history in a nutshell. That's how we would summarize everything. And so we said last week that the fact that the Bible presents a big picture story for all of humanity and all of human history, that fact alone argues against critical theory, because critical theory embraces this postmodern worldview that says there is no big story. In other words, there's not a story that you can tell that has explanatory power, in other words, can explain what life is all about for everybody. Your story is just the story of your community, of your people, and you can't import that over here and impose it on anybody else. The Bible is saying, no, the story of the history of Israel is not just simply the story of one little nation in the Middle East. God's story, what He's doing between Genesis and Revelation, is the story of all of humanity. And so we looked in the Bible last week for evidence of that the Bible presents itself not simply as the story of one local group or one particular religion, but as the story of all of humanity. So what we're going to do starting tonight and over the next few weeks is we're going to take each stage of the big story and we're going to look at it, see what Scripture has to say, and as we're looking at what Scripture has to say, we're going to try to examine the claims of critical theory or of the critical theory approach to social justice that we see at work in the world around us. Now, tonight I'm going to offer almost exclusively criticism of critical theory. That sounds kind of strange, but that's because when we're back at the doctrine of creation and we're looking at the story of creation, that's just the way that things unfold. But I will say, as we get into the fall, hopefully next week, and then redemption, that stage of the story, we will see more points of contact. What I mean is we will see some things that they point out that we need to recognize and respond to in a way other than simply saying, that's not true, throw it all away into the garbage. That there are some things that are pointed out. Perhaps their diagnosis of the problem is not true, not right, but the recognition of the problems ought to be, we should join in recognizing some of the issues and some of the problems. So we'll get to the point to where we can build some bridges, okay? But that's not really tonight. Tonight we're looking at the creation aspect of the story and then trying to reflect on some of the claims that are made by social justice advocates who are working with that critical theory type of mindset. All right? That's what we're going to do. So let's go back all the way to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1 opens up with those world-shaping words, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's a bombshell in and of itself, right? Because the Scriptures tell us that the universe is not the result of chance or impersonal forces. We don't exist because of some great cosmic coincidence. The Bible tells us from the very beginning that God made the world, and that means that God Himself is the author of reality, of the universe. God is the author. That's why in Colossians, Paul says that all things were created by Christ and for Christ. Or that's why Peter says in Acts 3:15 that Jesus is the author of life. God's the author of the big story that He's telling. And He's the author of human history. History is His story that He is telling. All right? So, His authorship gives Him ownership of the world. That's what we saw. That's at least one of the things we saw as we were reading through Psalm 50. Verse 1 begins, "The Mighty One, God, Yahweh, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting." God speaks and He calls the creation to respond to Him, and it naturally responds. When God calls the sun responds. And you jump down to verses 11 and 12, He says, "Every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine." He says, "The world and its fullness are mine." So God made the world, therefore God owns the world. He's the author of the world, and therefore He is the authority over the world. He has divine rights over the creation. Now, keep that in mind. That's what Genesis 1 is telling us. That's one of the main points of Genesis chapter 1, is to say that when God speaks, things come into existence. Things obey His word. He's the author and the authority over all of creation. That's one of the main points that Genesis 1 is making. But when you look at the foundation of critical theory, we said earlier that it really started with arguments over words and how language works, and over how you can discover the meaning of a written text. That's where critical theory really began. And the driving force of critical theory very early on was to tear down authors of books and of texts. That's the idea, to remove them from the scene entirely. So when we look at the response of our culture to the beginning of the biblical story, which says God is the author of all things, we should not be surprised at the way that they respond to that, because the culture has been primed not just to deny God's authorship, but to do the work of tearing down authors and removing their authority altogether. So just let me give you a quote from one of these earlier writers in this area. His name is Roland Barthes. He said this. He said, "We know now that a text is not a line of words releasing a single," and he puts this in quotes, "theological meaning." And then he has in parentheses, "the message of the author / God." He says, "But a text is a multi-dimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash." So that may sound confusing to you. what he's essentially saying is that when we're reading any book, it doesn't matter. He's not just talking about the Bible. He's talking about any book. When you're reading any book, you don't have to concern yourself with what the writer of that book was saying. Because the writer of that book doesn't get to decide what the meaning is. The book itself becomes, he calls it a multidimensional space. In other words, it becomes a kind of playground, and whoever's reading it gets to make up their own rules for what the text means. So the reader gets to shape reality, gets to decide what meaning really is. So let's say you write a book and you put it out there into the public sphere. And somebody gets your book, and the next thing you know, a few days later, you get you read a review of your book, and they're talking about what you say in your book, and you as you're reading the review, you think, that's not at all what I was saying. That's not at all what I meant. To which many reviewers today would say, it doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is what it means to me and my response to what you wrote, right? That's the approach. So that the reader becomes the sovereign. They become the one with authority. And the author is totally set aside. So you'll read these literary critics and they'll say things like, the author is dead. They don't mean that there aren't physical people who produce books, right? They don't mean that. I mean, they write books. They just mean the author as an authority figure. You can see the root word there. It doesn't exist anymore. There aren't any authors, they'll say things like that. Which means that the reader becomes the ultimate authority. The reader determines meanings, and therefore, there are as many meanings to a book or a text or anything that's written as there are readers. There are as many as there are. Now, that, I think for the normal, average person, that sounds weird. I really do. And I don't just mean for Christians who aren't used to this kind of stuff. I just think in the normal functioning of human life, we don't live like that. We don't live in a way where when someone walks by us and says, hi, how are you doing? We punch them in the face because we have the right to interpret that as an insult. Nobody lives like that. We all live as if people who say things or people who write things, their intention, what they mean, is what ultimately matters. And so we try our best to understand what other people say when we read what they write, or whenever we listen to their recording, if we're listening to their vlog or whatever it might be, we, generally speaking, we try to understand what it is they're trying to communicate to us, because that's just how normal people, I think, live and act. And I think, in fact, that's just a part of what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. Because when you say something to someone, you don't want them to just interpret it any old way they feel like, right? You love your neighbor as yourself, so you extend to them the same kind of courtesy. You want to understand what they mean when they say something. Critical theory says that doesn't matter. The reader decides meaning. The reader gets to say what a text means. And all that is so that the author can be removed. And they're not even sneaky about it. We read that quote earlier where the writer essentially equates the author with God. He refers to the single meaning of a passage, of a text, as the theological meaning. What they are trying to do is to remove entirely from us the idea of an authority figure who can say, this is what life means. And they do that by removing essentially all authority figures. And that brushes up against the very first movement in the story that God is telling, right? We don't live in a world without authors. We certainly don't live in a world without the capital A author. Go back to Genesis 1, okay? You can take a look in verse 3, where God speaks, right? He says, let there be light. And when God speaks, when He says something, things happen. Right? He's a speaking God, and He creates things with His words. Not only that, but Hebrews 1:3 says that the Son upholds the universe by the word of His power. So in the story of creation, God is the author and the sustainer of all things. As I said earlier, history is really His story, which means He gets to offer the authoritative interpretation of it. Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. He is the truth with sort of a capital T. What the doctrine of creation teaches us is that truth exists. And ultimately, truth can be found in God Himself. And then you keep sort of working your way through the creation story. And what is the high point? What's the apex of the story of creation? Yeah, the creation of human beings in the image of God. First, God makes the world, right? Then He kind of forms and fashions it, makes it suitable for human beings, and then He puts man in the world, and He says, have dominion, exercise authority over the world. To be more specific, in Genesis chapter 2, He puts Adam in the garden and tells him to work and keep the garden. Work and keep. That's the language of worship in the temple. That's the language of the work of the priests in the temple. So, in a sense, we could say the world has been formed and fashioned for man, but ultimately man has been formed and fashioned for God Himself. Now, what all that means in terms of this business of authors and readers is that God, as the author, demands that we be responsible readers of His story. That we don't make up our own parts. That we don't insert ourselves into the story anytime that we want. That we don't change the story or we don't dismiss the story. We don't get to make up our own meaning in life. We don't get to do that. God's the author. God made everything. And when He makes us in His image, He calls us to live in a certain way. I mentioned this a little bit on Sunday in my sermon, but to be made in the image of God is not about your ability, it's mainly about your responsibility. We are made and designed by God to reflect His glory to the rest of creation by our relationships, by loving God and loving our neighbor, right? Two greatest commandments. And then by ruling over the creation and representing God. He makes us and designs us for that very purpose. And as New Covenant believers, one of the things that we need to recognize is that God at work, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but God at work in redemption, moving toward restoration, He calls us new creatures or new creations, right? Because as far away as we may have drifted from the creation mandates or our original purpose, as far away as we may have drifted from that, in Christ, God is moving us back toward that, and then ultimately even beyond that, to something better, to something that had been held out and reserved for His people from the very beginning, that was even better than the Garden of Eden. God's moving us somewhere. And if He's moving us back toward what He originally made us to be, then we need to, as followers of Christ, we need to make sure that we are looking, directing our attention back toward creation to try to understand in a little bit better way, what does God want us to be and to do? Right? What is He expecting of us? What is it that He wants us to look like as we sort of plod our way around the world? Now, what that means in terms of Christian ethics, or to use the language we've been using, what that means in deciding what is justice and what is injustice is that our ought, right, what we ought to do, our ought is derived from our being. Not, okay, you guys understand what I'm saying? Like what we ought to do, what we ought to be, flows out of who we are. That is, what God made us to be. Being made in God's image means that we ought to live in a particular way, a way that is defined by God Himself. And we see that laid out for us very clearly in the creation account. Now, we need the rest of Scripture, okay, to help us better understand and to help us fill in some of the gaps that are left in the creation account. I'm not saying all we need is Genesis 1 and 2 to live the Christian life, but that should be our starting point. That should be how we begin to think about and reflect upon how does the Christian live? And how do we assess the issues of injustice that are around us? How do we know if something is a matter of injustice? How do we even know that? Because one of the things that we're going to see as we start looking at the problems that are highlighted within critical social justice is that sometimes we're going to say, yeah, that is a problem. Other times we're going to say, yeah, no, that's not an injustice at all. In fact, what you are pushing for would be an injustice because it goes against God's design in creation. Okay? So we have to sort of be aware of our starting point. We need to look back to the creation account to try to understand what it is that we ought to be as people that are made in God's image. So here's what we need to do for the next few minutes. We need to think through, just briefly, because we can't go into all the details, and I want to try as best we can to keep our reflections limited to in the light of the creation part of the story. Okay? There are some things that I'm going to try and hold off until we get to the other parts of the story. But I want to start by trying to think of some of the main issues that are put in front of us. So, at least in this part of our study, we have to admit that sort of the agenda is being set by critical theory or by the culture itself, really. What issues they look at and put out there as important. And I want to look at some of those issues and try, in the light of the creation story, try to say, okay, so what does the Bible, what does God have to say about this? What is the biblical approach to this particular issue in light of what God did in creation? So, let's start with racism, okay? You can't read online, you can't turn on the news, you can't do anything without being confronted by the reality of racism in the world. You can't. It's unavoidable, okay? Even if you feel like you live in your own little bubble and there are no issues of racism in your bubble, you just get on social media, you turn on the news, you do whatever it is, you interact with anyone outside of your little small circle that you've created, and you're going to find, here it is, right in front of us all the time. And we can't respond to that by simply saying, well, that's not an issue. That's not a problem. That's not real. We can't respond in that way. The reason that we can't respond in that way is because what we see in the world is at odds with God's design in creation when it comes to issues of race. That's just reality. What we see in the world is at odds. And even what we see oftentimes in the church is at odds with God's design in creation. So, for instance, Paul says in Acts 17:26, God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. He made from one man every nation of mankind, every ethnic group. We all come from one man. And so, therefore, even just on the surface of it, in Scripture, there aren't different races. There's just the human race. That's it. There are no other races. There are different nations. There are different groupings of peoples, and those don't exist by accident either. The same God who created everything rules providentially over the world, and Paul says that He determined the allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. So we need to, at the same time, deny that there are distinct, different races or people of different values. There are not. And then be able to turn around and celebrate the fact that God has, in His wisdom, brought out of this one man great diversity into the world. Which means we can't treat any single descendant of Adam or any group of people as if they are any less, or as if they possess fewer rights or less dignity than any other image bearer. We cannot do that. But we also cannot impose all of our cultural standards on every other culture as if culture equals race and there's no such thing as race, therefore let's get rid of all the different cultures. We can't do that. God Himself made from one man all the nations to live upon the face of the earth. So we should, as Christians, we should at every turn deny racism and embrace the varied cultures that God has created and made. But of course, every culture that we look at, even as we celebrate the diversity that we see around us, every culture in their own unique ways will have deviated from the creation pattern, won't they? Including our own. Right? You can celebrate some diversity around you while recognizing that some aspects of that diversity, if they don't fit with the story that God is telling, some aspects of that diversity need to be set aside. Some aspects of our own culture do not fit with what we read in Scripture, and they need to be set aside. We may not even be aware of some of those aspects until we see the contrast between our culture and another culture. And in a particular area, we may conclude that by God's grace, His common grace, in one area, this culture is a little closer than our own culture. Let me give you an example. I think I'm just kind of talking in it. Let me give you an example. We, in America, but in the West in general, but particularly in America, we are very, very individualistic. Okay? We always think in things of the rights of the individual, right? We think of ourselves as individuals who simply, by choice, interact with others, okay? And we're sort of disjointed and disconnected in some ways. You go to other cultures, and you will find that they don't have that idea that we have of the individual, right? That it's not enshrined in the way that they think. So that the ways that they think are always not of themselves as an individual, but of themselves as a son, a husband, a tribal leader, or whatever it might be. It's their role in society that defines who they are. Okay, we by and large in America don't think in that way. But if you look in the Scriptures, there is a stream of thought that says you can't simply consider yourself as an individual. Because Paul says, in Adam all die. We are one in Adam. You try to explain the doctrine of original sin to your average American Christian, and their response will probably be, God wouldn't hold me responsible for what Adam did. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. But He does. Right? Because your rugged individualism does not fit with that doctrine rooted in creation. We are in Adam. Doesn't fit for us. We see that being played out in the history of Israel. Never strike you as strange that when David sinned by taking a census of the people, God gave him a few choices in terms of what sort of punishment He would bring. And those choices involved the suffering of the whole nation. Why would you bring famine on the whole nation because David sinned? Why would you do that? For us, as Americans, with this individualistic mindset, that makes no sense and that seems unjust. But from the biblical point of view, well, David is the representative of Israel, just as Adam is the representative of all humanity. David is the representative of Israel, just as Christ is the representative of all who are in him. And it's passed over in the story. It's not debated. It's not commented on. It's just a fact. The king sins. All the people who are represented by him suffer with him in his sin. And if your gut reaction to that is that's unjust, and if you're calling what God himself does and decrees unjust, that means that your view of justice is not aligned with the Bible's view. Because God, by definition, cannot do that which is unjust. Whatever God does, by definition, is just and right. So that if you have trouble stomaching the things that God does, then that's probably because, in terms of the doctrine of creation and our understanding of the individual versus what some theologians call corporate solidarity, that we're bound with others, our understanding of that needs to be adjusted. And we might look to other cultures and see those other cultures are a little bit closer in the way that they think to this aspect of the Bible's teachings. Again, that are rooted in creation. So, when we're looking at different cultures, what we have to understand is we can celebrate the diversity of cultures and also critique those aspects of other cultures and our own that don't align with the biblical story. But in doing all of that, we do that on the basis of recognizing that we all have the same worth and value and dignity. Part of the reason that it's so difficult for some of us to recognize ways in which other cultures might be in some sense superior to our own is because there is still a hint deep within us, a hint of the idea that we are better. We are better than they are. If we are better in any ways, it's just because of God's grace, and it has nothing to do with our DNA or our background. It has nothing to do with any of that. It's just by God's grace. And if they are better than us in ways, it's just by God's grace. A biblical understanding of both the unity of the human race in Adam and the diversity that we see around us, a biblical understanding of those things, will challenge us because God stands as the author and He decides and He determines right and wrong. He does. That's creation and racism. In fact, here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to sum up what I have written here on creation and abortion in a sentence or two because I just preached on it Sunday. And that'll help us move ahead. All right? When we think about the abortion issue, this is an issue of justice. It's an issue of rightness and wrongness. When we go back to creation, what we see is that all human beings are created in the image of God. I made this argument Sunday. Therefore, all human beings, regardless of age, regardless of their size, regardless of their development, all human beings are of inestimable worth and value. And to do violence against the image of God in the womb is fundamentally no different than doing violence against the image of God anywhere else. So we have to understand the issue of abortion against the teaching that we're all made in God's image. All right? For more on that, go listen to Sunday again. All right? Let's jump ahead because we've only got about 10 minutes before they need us to get the kids and stuff. Let's jump ahead to issues of human sexuality and gender. I think it's here maybe that the teachings of the Bible are going to be most at odds with where our culture has landed. Okay? The doctrine of creation tells us that God is the author of all things, including man as male and female. And therefore, He gets to define the purposes and the boundaries of human sexuality. Genesis 1:27. God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created them. Male and female He created them. It's not an accident that the very next verse tells us God's mandate, which includes be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We can't do what we're made to do as human beings, what God commissions us to do, without both male and female sexes. Can't do it, right? Of course, in the biblical story, male and female is about more than just biological distinctions. Those are really important, but it's about more than that. Because when you get to Genesis chapter 2, where Moses is going to sort of expand upon the creation of this first human pair, he really highlights the differences between male and female. Right? He begins the story, God says, he looks and he sees Adam and he says, it's not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. That phrase, fit for him, means something along the lines of corresponds to him. That is different in all the right ways. They are not the same. Male and female are not the same. There is a reason why Eve is called Adam's helper. And that by itself is not a term of subjugation or anything like that. God is sometimes called the helper of Israel in the Scriptures. That's not the point of that term. The point of that term is not that, but the point is that man has been given a commission, and now God creates Eve to assist him in that task, to be beside him in that task. And they do, in the pursuit of the task that he's given them, they do have different roles to play. And those roles do, at least in marriage, involve roles of authority and submission. That's just reality as the Bible presents it. In fact, when the Apostle Paul looks back on Genesis chapter 2, he sees the fact that Adam was created before Eve as clear evidence that Adam is supposed to be the leader and the head of his family. You can see that in 1 Timothy 2, 12 and 13. Adam is the head of his wife Eve, and together they're supposed to rule over the rest of creation. Now, one of the things we're going to see when we get to the fall is that the serpent comes on the scene and he reverses everything. Right? The order is, husband, wife, ruling over all of creation. Satan comes as a creature that man should rule over, right? Approaches Eve, who then influences Adam. Everything's backwards in Genesis chapter 3 from the order presented in Genesis chapter 2. We're going to talk about that more next week. My point is to say here that Genesis chapter 2 clearly communicates differences and distinctions in men and women, and those are most clearly seen in marriage. But according to the postmodern lens of critical theory, there's no fixed norm for gender identity and sexuality. Right? Even the use of the term identity by the LGBTQ plus community, even that term itself is a failure to understand that our identity as human beings is not rooted in our sexual preferences or our sexual behavior. That's not who you are. It's not who you are. You are an image bearer of God. That's your identity. That's who you are. And you are either in Adam or in Christ. Those are identity markers for us. But your sexual desires have nothing to do with your identity, with who you are. That is not how our culture views these things. If you tell a person that you believe it is wrong for them to live a homosexual lifestyle, they will find themselves highly offended because they believe you're attacking not what they do, but who they are. Because they've made the mistake of thinking that their identity is rooted in their desires. And their identity is not to be rooted in their desires. The story of the Bible begins by telling us we have a Creator and that it is He, our Creator, not our own desires, that determines who we are and what we do. If our desires do not align with God's design, it is we who must adjust, not God, not His design and plan for the world. I said earlier, our ought flows from our being. if our fundamental identity is that of image of God, and then secondarily male and female, then it's not our desires, not our self-determined desires that decide who we are. In the light of the creation story, we are who God says we are, not who we feel like we are. But it's taken a while for our culture to arrive at the moment where identity is determined by things like your sexual desires. It's taken some time. Well, it's not that we can't look throughout human history and see every form of sexual immorality that's prevalent today. We can see it throughout history, okay? But within the history of our own sort of culture in the West, if you rewind back to more than 100 years ago, more or less, and I'm painting with a very broad brush here, more or less, the sexual mores of society mirrored those of biblical Christianity. More or less. There are some pretty serious abuses, but more or less, okay? And so over the last 100 years or so, there has been a concerted effort to move us away from the biblical view of sexuality. And it's been successful. Very successful. Now that move has taken place because of a lot of very influential thinkers and writers, some of which you've probably heard of, others that you may not have heard of. I'm sure all of you have heard of Sigmund Freud, right? He's not necessarily the only starting point for trying to figure out how we move from a more or less biblical approach to sexuality to where we are today, but he's a good starting point because in sort of the early to mid 20th century, he began to teach that all human behavior is inextricably tied to our sexual desires. Like what motivates everything we do, he would say, is tied to our sexual desires. And here's one thing that he wrote. He says that religion is a system of wishful illusions together with a disavowal of reality. What he meant was who we are is sexual beings, and we're driven by sexual desires, and the goal of religion is to repress all of those desires. That's what he believed. He believed that humans were highly evolved animals, and therefore all of our desires and instincts were just natural. And so he argued that we won't really be free until we rid ourselves of all constraints in the area of sexuality. That was his essential argument. Now, he died in 1939. Around the end of his life, or really right after the end of his life, I suppose, you see a bunch of research being done by a guy named Alfred Kinsey. Has anybody ever heard of him? Anybody? A few? Okay. All right. He wrote the Kinsey reports. He did.
Were they kind of like at odds with each other?
For Kinsey and Freud?
Yeah.
He's building off some of the ideas. Yes.
Kind of like their separate ways. I don't know.
Yeah, he's building off some of his ideas.
Is he the one that made the scale?
Yes. Yeah. He wrote this thing called the Kinsey Reports. Came out in two parts. He did this massive survey, interviews, study of people, asking them all sorts of questions about their sexual history, their sexual desires, all these things. But ultimately, what he pushed for was the normalization of homosexuality, of pornography, of all sorts of things that the Bible would regard as immoral behavior. So then it's not a real big surprise when you realize, what he was doing and what he's writing. One of his sort of partners in crime, a fellow researcher named Harry Benjamin, in 1966, who was a part of all these studies, wrote the first textbook on transsexualism, right? Here's what he says. I want you to just listen for some connections to some of the themes we're talking about. He says, the old language of opposite sexes, that's in quotation marks, derived from the theological mythology that God created male and female as absolutely separate creatures, has been modified by modern biology. You see where they're not hiding the fact that they want to push away the biblical account. They don't hide that. They're open about that. These are people that are writing and having a big influence in the mid-20th century. A guy named Robert Stoller, who came a little bit later, he was the one who introduced the idea of gender and sex being distinct realities, that your physical sex doesn't have to correspond to your gender. He introduced that idea. He introduced the idea of maleness and femaleness being sort of just a personal inward awareness that may or may not match your physical sex. He introduces that idea. At the same time that you have these guys who are writing about these radical ideas in terms of sexual morality and behavior, you have radical feminism that is on the rise. Not the feminism that is the kind of feminism pushing for, women's right to vote earlier on in the 20th century. This is radical feminism. So you have probably the most well-known from this period of time, Simone de Beauvoir. Anybody ever heard of her? Maybe. She says in one of her writings, this is one of her most famous statements, one is not born a woman, but becomes a woman. She devoted her career largely to tearing down what she viewed as patriarchy, as men dominating women. And most of her career was about tearing down that system. All of these different writers who are pushing for a different sexual morality in the 20th century, all of them share in common, even though they argue with each other, they don't all get along, they don't all have the same views of everything. One of the things that they share is they're looking at the world through these lenses that we've associated with critical theory. Right? So critical theory, we said, starts by saying binary oppositions in our language. Things like good, bad, okay, true, false, male, female, those kinds of things. Those are language games invented by people in power who decide what language is in order to control people. That's the argument that they make. Well, building upon that, they're not just saying that the words themselves are a language game. They're saying the concepts themselves, concepts of male and female, concepts of sexual immorality versus sexually acceptable behavior. Those concepts themselves, they're saying, need to be done away with. They need to be torn down. That should sound familiar, right? There's a reason why this is called the sexual revolution. They were not interested in convincing others to tolerate behavior. They were interested in tearing down the existing and at that time prevailing morality when it came to sexuality. A prevailing morality that we already said mirrors to a large degree the biblical teachings on human sexuality. And their goal is to tear all of that down. Well, we probably need to finish up here. So let me just say a couple things, all right? I don't think it's an accident that when you look at people like Freud, Kinsley, and some of these others that we mentioned, and several more that we could mention, that these who kind of become the architects and the pioneers of the sexual revolution, I don't think it's an accident that all of them built their worldviews upon a Darwinian foundation. You wonder, why such a swift, radical departure suddenly in the 20th century? Because at the end of the 19th century, Charles Darwin's writings became widely known and spread all over the world. And they don't hide their reliance upon Darwin to justify their worldview. Here's what one of the writers that I quoted from earlier, he says this. He says, Darwin's theory has pointed up the identity of male and female origins. Out of the same basic living molecules, there were evolved different sex patterns, male and female. Thus, the old language of opposite sexes, and this comes from a quote I read earlier, derived from the theological mythology that God created male and female as absolutely separate creatures, has been modified by modern biology. What he means is Darwin's discoveries set aside the biblical story, and therefore male and female is a construct we get to do away with. We can rewrite the story of humanity, but first they have to displace the author of the story. That's what critical theory is all about. That's the starting point for the sexual revolution. And I'm out of time. I will let you guys ask a few questions, though, before we're done. So, fire away.
I just have two statements. One is I keep hearing, did God really say?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I keep hearing, don't you believe the science?
Right. Yeah. Terrell?
So earlier you said that when talking about sexuality, that just and I'm asking this to clarify that historically things have usually reflected the biblical approach to
In the West,
in the West.
since the advent of the growth of Christianity in the West.
That's not in reference to like pagan sex rituals or like anything.
No, so it wouldn't reference like paganism, which paganism technically would be like Celtic religion and Germanic religions before Christianity came in. And it wouldn't include Rome and Greece before Christianity became dominant. Yeah. I mean, the Western culture as it is today, which is a combination of Christian values and some of the values and teachings of Plato and Socrates. That's kind of what I mean by Western. Yeah.